Okay, next up, I'm inviting Scott Croshere to come and talk about the cables project.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Croshere. I'm a staff engineer in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department here at Berkeley. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and a number of researchers that I got to work with. We work in the Advanced Manufacturing for Energy group and the Berkeley Sensor and Actuator Center. The title of my talk today is The Sensing and Diagnostics of Energized Underground Cables. And this work was done under a contract with the California Energy Commission. So a little bit of background about our project here. The electrical distribution grid that we have in urban areas is up to 70% underground. So there's a large network of this running underground in cities. And PG&E maintains up to 57,000 miles of primary distribution cable. I've got a picture of a vault that they call them with the cables running underneath. This is in New York City, so it's a very complicated network of cables that's running underneath there. These cables run at 12,000 to 35,000 volts, so this is a pretty serious electrical distribution grid. So about the cables themselves, these are meant for three-phase systems, and the cables that we're looking at here are composed of a number of different parts. We have on the outside, we have a jacket, and that surrounds a series of concentric neutrals. In this talk, I call them CNs a lot because it's kind of a mouthful, but those CNs are sitting in a bed of a semiconducting rubber layer, and then that surrounds the orange part, which you can see there. That's the insulation. And then inside that, of course, is another semiconducting shield surrounding the large central conductor, which is the current carrying part of the cable here. And the central conductor is stranded so that this cable can remain flexible and somewhat possible to string through these underground vaults. So the concentric neutrals, this is a very important part of these cables. They provide two functions. One is sort of an electrical shield for the cable to protect it, and then also they provide a return path for current if the three-phase system is unbalanced. And then also, obviously, very important is the insulation layer. So we were talking about this a bit too, but the insulation layer can keep the central conductor electrically away from the concentric neutrals, and also provides protection for the cable as it's running throughout its assemblies underground. So we're looking at two common failure modes that we see with these cables underground. The first one is the loss of protective shield. This is the concentric neutrals that I was talking about. There's a picture in the upper right here of a failure. These are pretty catastrophic failures when the concentric neutrals go bad. And the concentric neutrals can become damaged from a couple of different cases. One from during installation. These cables come on these huge spools on the back of trucks. They get pulled down underground through the vaults and then through these conduits. And so they can be damaged that way. Also, once they're in place, the concentric neutrals can corrode. They're just these sort of metal wires that can corrode over time. And then finally, manufacturing defects are also an issue that can happen in the cable. And it's very hard to see these ahead of time before you go ahead and lay the cable underground. So the second common problem that I want to talk about is insulation flashover. So this is where the insulation, that orange part in the previous slide, degrades to a point where an arc can happen through the insulation, actually, between the central conductor and the concentric neutrals. So in the manufacture of this cable, the insulation contains these tiny voids, which isn't necessarily a problem on its own. But over time, due to the Maxwell mechanical stresses, these tiny voids will be connected by these channels. And so there's a picture on the bottom here. When these voids get connected, it forms what's called trees. And so you can see the trees growing in this bottom picture. It's a thin slice of a cable. And it's sort of connecting the inner conductor on the top there with the outside of the cable on the bottom. And so these are called tree structures, and now these cables exist underground in sort of challenging situations where there can be lots of water, dirty water, and in this case the water can get into the trees, and those are called water trees, and can cause a situation where installation flashover could happen. And again, this is definitely a catastrophic failure that we want to avoid. So presently, utility companies, they have a couple tests that they can go through to find out if a cable is damaged. One of them is time-domain reflectometry, and basically that involves sending a signal through the cable and looking for reflections as to where faults might be. Another is tan delta testing, and that looks for capacitance changes in the insulation from the degradation of the insulation. And also there's high pot testing, which involves bringing the cable up to somewhere around twice its working voltage and looking for actual failures. That can be a little bit destructive. But the main thing here is that all these current tests, they require turning off the cable to take it out of service to run this test. And this is something that can be definitely expensive and time-consuming for utility companies. And also, these cables have a rated sort of service lifetime. And so the companies could just certainly replace a cable without even knowing if it's good or bad, if it's reached its certain lifespan. But this doesn't really help if a cable has failed prematurely, and it also involves replacing a cable that maybe still has serviceable life left. So our project goals here with this project, we want to enable technicians to be able to quickly and easily test energized cables. So these are cables that are in service, and we want it to be performed at these utility vaults. These are sort of the access points to the cables. And so with these utility vaults, you can see there's one here in a picture. There's only a small portion of the cable showing. A lot of it runs underground. So we want our test to be able to give you an idea the health of the cable, not only at the test site, but sort of in the physically unreachable areas underneath the ground. So we want having these tests being cheap and easy so they can be performed often. We definitely want safety tests to be performed often, trust me, with these high voltage cables underground. And then we want them to be compatible with existing safety gear. In this picture here, there's a technician's using what's called a hot stick. It's a long fiberglass pole that's fully insulated, and it allows someone to manipulate an energized circuit. And it has a standard tool attachment on the end. So our solution to the first problem, this is the problem of the concentric neutrals going bad. We have a solution called the grabber. The grabber, in this picture here on the left, you can see there's a small section of cable that the grabber is attached to. It has the grabber is the yellow part, and it has the jaws on the left there. And importantly, on the right, it has the hot stick attachment. So it can attach to the end of the hot stick in the picture that you just saw. And this is a really simple to operate tool. You attach it to the end of the grabber. You can lower it down into a utility vault, and all you have to do is press it against a cable to be tested. The grabber will open up. Cable slides inside. The test is completed quickly and easily. The data can be sent out. And then all you have to do is pull it to remove it. And I have a quick video that can show you how it works. So yeah, it's pretty simple. It's all mechanical. You just push it on. I thank my colleague Eric for making that cool video. So the grabber, super simple, super easy to use, and it's incredibly cheap. We just 3D printed this here. And it's a good way for us to get our sensors into position around the cable. And it houses all the circuitry that we need in order to make this. So you can see in the picture here, on the left side, we have our sensors wrapped around on the green PCB there, around the inside of the cable. Those are GMR sensors. That stands for giant magnetoresistive. The idea here is that they change their resistance in the presence of a magnetic field along the sensitive axis. And in this case, they're single-axis sensors. So we have them all aligned to be aligned with the radial component of the cable's magnetic field. And there's a picture down here of one of our little sensors next to a penny, so they're really small. So in this case, it's really nice because we can fit a bunch of sensors in right next to the concentric neutrals. In this case, we have 10 sensors, and that corresponds with the 10 concentric neutrals in this particular wire that we're testing. So then the sensors all output to the circuits on the right side of our picture. They output to a multiplexer, which then goes to an amplifier, and this is all controlled by an ARM microcontroller, so we can take a bunch of samples really quickly, store them on the device's onboard flash. And then, of course, because this device is at the end of a large insulated hot stick, and a technician is at the other end, so we can't have any wires connecting that. So there's a Bluetooth low-energy radio in there, and it can essentially take the collected data and send it out right away to a technician's laptop or iPhone or iPad. So let's look at some simulated data here. We have a continuous graph of the magnetic field of a healthy cable with 10 concentric neutrals energized. What we're looking at here is the blue line in that left graph. It's kind of up on the top there. And that corresponds to the radial component of the magnetic field. So the reason why we're looking at the radial component of the magnetic field is, if you remember before, we have all these concentric neutrals on the outside, and then on the inside we have the central conductor, which is carrying quite a bit more current, and it will be in the opposing direction. So we'll have an opposing magnetic field to the one coming from the concentric neutrals. And because of the geometry of these cables, we found that the radial component of the magnetic field is less overwhelmed from those magnetic fields. And then on the right, you'll see we have a FFT of the data, and there's a huge peak at wave number 10, corresponding to the 10 concentric neutrals that we have in our test cable. And so that's really good for us. It makes it really simple. So then, of course, the next test is to simulate a bad cable, or one of the concentric neutrals not carrying any current. And that's what we see here in the graph on the left. You can see there's a definite change from the concentric neutral not carrying any current. And then on the right, we see, in addition to the peak at wave number 10, we also have a peak at 1, showing us that there's a clear difference between healthy cables and unhealthy cables. Oh, yes, and I should say that this is looking at one point on the cable, but if you remember, we want our test to give us information about the more than just our test point of the cable, the parts of the cable that are unreachable underground. And so you might think, if there's a wire carrying current, that current should be the same in all the points of the wire, so it should be good for the entire length. But those concentric neutrals are sitting in a bed of a semiconducting material, rubber. And so while it won't necessarily save the cable from a catastrophic failure, if a CN goes bad, the current can actually go around a broken segment of concentric neutral. And so from our calculations on the resistance of this semiconducting material, our test should be valid for 100 feet in either direction on the cable from the actual test point. So here's some data that we took from the grabber itself. That was simulations before, and so here's some data that we actually took once the grabber got put together, and we have a test bench that we tried it on. And then we have, so this is a 10 CN cable, and on the left we have the outputs from sampling one 60 hertz cycle from all 10 of our CNs, and they're all plotted on top of each other here. And so the interesting thing is all of the concentric neutrals, all 10 of them, have the same current on them, so you'd think the magnitude of the magnetic field would be the same. But as you can see from our graph here, they definitely aren't. And it turns out that this is because the concentric neutrals on the outside of the cable are not all precisely spaced. It turns out that in manufacturing the cable, it's just not economical to precision place them all. And it's not really even necessary for the proper functioning of the cable to have them all precisely spaced. So on the grabber, we do have precisely spaced sensors. And so if a concentric neutral falls to either side of the sensor, we get a differing amplitude. And you can see the amplitude's graphed on the right there. That's definitely one of the things we talked about a lot in this project, is telling, is a concentric neutral gone bad, or is it just sort of massively misplaced on the cable? So what we do to look at that is we look at, again, the fast Fourier transform of the data. And this data is from the same data I showed on the last slide. And so on the bottom here, these blue dots, that corresponds to a cable with all the concentric neutrals intact and conducting current. And then the red dots correspond to a cable where sort of one of the CNs is not carrying current. And what's important to note here is that we see, definitely we see different frequencies present in a cable that's healthy versus unhealthy. And so what we intend to do is take a look at a number of different cables and establish thresholds for cables that are working versus ones that are not working. And we can suggest cables that are strong candidates for replacement. And this is really what the utility companies want, because if you remember, now their tests involve turning off a cable or simply replacing without knowing. So here we can provide feedback on a live energized cable that's in the field and say, yes, this is a candidate for replacement. All right, so this is our second solution to the second problem. This is the degradation of the insulation material on the cable. And we have a solution involving RF injection. And that's going to look for water trees that have formed in the insulation layer of the cable that can provide a fault. And in this picture, this is the same picture as before, but what's actually happening here is the tech has his hot stick here, and he's manipulating these elbows. And that's what I brought for my show and tell, actually, is we have one of these elbows. This thing's pretty cool. But this is essentially a high voltage power connector, and it has these hooks on the ends here so that it can be manipulated while, from a distance with the hot stick while it's energized. And one of the things that worked out really great for us is that it has these caps that can be pulled off, and a connector here that provides a 16 picofarad connection to the central conductor of the cable. And then the concentric neutrals, actually the connection is made outside of this. So this provides a great spot for us to do our RF injection tests on the corner connectors. So a little bit about the water trees. Again, there's small voids from manufacture in the insulation. And then this is a simplified diagram that we have here on the right of how these water trees form. These microchannels form sort of all in the same direction because of the Maxwell stresses in the line of the electric field. And so those grow over time, and then they kind of form these water trees that will all these channels will exist in sort of the same axis there. And then when they fill with dirty water, now we have a situation where the permittivity of the shielding has changed because we have these water trees that exist in there. And that's what we're looking for to detect with our RF injection method. So here at the bottom, we have a diagram of sort of two end caps on either end of a cable. And what we hope to do is have a generator, RF generator, attached to the caps on one end of the cable and an RF detector on the other side. We've experimentally confirmed that we can couple a 1 megahertz signal to the cable and look for reflections. And then we will measure the attenuation of, and velocity propagation in the cable to look for faults that are caused by the water trees throughout the length of the cable. And then with this data, we can say, again, this is a strong candidate for replacement. So we were able to run this test in the lab with a number of cables that we bought that were brand new, that were working great, and we were able to couple our RF signal to them, and that worked just great. But the problem is actually finding a cable that has water trees. Well, this happens to lots of cables eventually in the field. They just throw them out after they pull them out of the ground. So we were actually eventually able to get hold of some of these cables with known bad water trees from the Electrical Power Research Institute. And they had been out of the ground, out of the vault for a while. So while there was trees, they weren't full of water. So that's what's going on in this picture here. Is we got a large pot and put the cables in and boiled it for a weekend in salty water to try and force the water back into the cables in a hurry, salty conducting water. So once we did that, we got the cables out, and we were able to take a Megger insulation tester and run that along the exposed insulation and confirm that, yes, we did now have spots with changed permittivity on the insulation, and that confirmed that we did have water trees. So we're still working on this to collect baseline data as well as data for faulty cables. But once we have those two things, then our system can be used to detect faulty insulation in cables that are in service in the field quickly. And so in conclusion here, we have two methods for easily testing energized cables in the field. Both of them are economical and can be deployed rapidly by field service technicians in the field operating on live energized circuits at these vaults with existing safety gear. And so being able to identify these underground power grids in our huge underground power network, the ones that have problems before they fail, is actually, turns out it's a huge part of the intelligent energy infrastructure that is always growing beneath us, actually. So that's all I have for today, so I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that anyone might have.
Any questions?
No questions. Well, I just want to.
Thank you, Scott. What was the original purpose of that 16 picofarad connection, and why wasn't the time domain reflectometry already being done through that with energized cables?
So as far as I understand it, the original reason why those caps are on there is actually just to test the cables are fully de-energized before running their tests. I'm not exactly sure why they're not currently running the time domain reflectometry on it, but I have a feeling it has to do with the type of equipment that's used to do that.
But that point is just a test point. So when you drop a line for clearance, you want to make sure the line is dead before you pull it out.
That cap.
Right. That's all. That was the sole purpose.
Sole purpose, to make sure that if you're going to touch it, that this cable is indeed off.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Thanks again,
Thank you.
Scott.